Pardon the interruption, I'm Chris Gehrz. Sam, today, July 5th, is National Apple Turnover Day. What's your take on the apple turnover?
Frankly, I don't see what all the fuss is about. Maybe if I used red apples. Welcome to PTI, boys and girls. I'm Sam Mulberry. Chris,
how's that apple tree?
it's really fantastic.
Great.
It was a really good apple. I can't wait to finish it during the break.
Okay.
In our last webisode, we had, we have the test coming up, so we're going to be doing a lot of review, prepping for that. In the last webisode, we had the students respond to sort of a discussion about justice. And not surprisingly, a lot of students talked about sort of the MLK Antigone sort of understanding or definition of justice. So I want to sort of flip the question on you and say, what's the best argument against that appeal to divine law?
Right, and I mean, it's predictable. I think it fits fairly well with the Christian worldview, right? Is that there's law beyond this world, that it's moral, that it's just, that it's eternal, it's unchanging, it's not subject to sin and all that, right? And so that makes sense, and I resonate with it. I mean, I was really happy to see a lot of students push back, and some kind of picked up on Thucydides' sort of realism or cynicism and say, this just doesn't work in this world. It's always going to be about power to some level, and you can resist it, but at the end of the day, the powerful do what they will, and the weak suffer what they must. Some picked up on Creon and said, partly it's just like we need good leadership and a good ruler, and they sympathize with that. To me, the most important philosophical comeback to this idea that human law needs to line up with eternal law is that one adjective that applies to eternal law is that it's invisible. Especially for the Greeks who don't have scripture. Christians and Jews and Muslims are people of the book, and so they can say, well, let's open the Bible to this page, and it tells us here's what's moral. And
I'm sure this course will show us that's never come.
Yeah, there's only one interpretation, right? I mean, so it's hard within a Christian or other religious community. It's really hard in a religiously plural society where over 20% of the population now, and it's much higher in Europe, isn't even religious. How do you appeal to the eternal law? And we'll eventually talk about things like natural law, which comes out of the Middle Ages and Thomas Aquinas, and you can find that in the MLK reading. He actually talks more about that than he does about Scripture, for example. But that is how do we make that appeal as people of faith to say this law, whether it's about abortion or marriage or about what a good wage to pay people is or working conditions? How do you do that if people don't?
Right, and are there? I mean, thinking about King, are there different levels where we look at sort of this eternal or divine law, right? Like King is talking about sort of the importance of human dignity and those types of things. And is that the same as in Scripture it says this, so therefore, I mean, is it all? And this is what I always find interesting because I grew up. This is getting maybe a little far afield, but I grew up in the Catholic Church, and I remember being taught about sort of sin as having these all kinds of degrees, and then I encountered people where it was like sin is sin.
It's all the same.
Law is is it or is there a degree? I think that's really interesting, to think about in terms of the divine law.
Yeah. So I mean, the main takeaway I actually want to say is thanks to students for really taking that question seriously. They'd actually had a kind of earlier version of the question with the Antigone assignment, but they clearly went back and thought about it and re-examined the arguments. So
well, it was exciting to read your responses, especially those who were responding to what somebody else wrote. Yes. I think that was really great.
And so one thing we're going to change for the Unit 2 discussion board coming up after the test is instead of saying you can either respond to someone or start a new thread, we're just going to have like 2 or 3 or 4 threads, depending on what the question is. One of us will probably kind of queue them up, and then whether you're the first or the third, we do want you responding then to people. This is discussion. It's the one kind of synchronous thing we've got where you get to engage with other people and not be by yourself. So that'll be one thing we'll push a little bit harder this coming board. Sam, we've finished now, I think, 2 of the museums and then 3 worksheets because one of the museums had 2. It's maybe the most distinctive part of the class. A lot of students commented on not being sure what to expect, and at least certain rooms really resonated. It was a fun experiment. It's also hard to know how to deal with them. I would guess students by this point have started to kind of figure out how do you use these, how do you complete the assignments. Any advice as the person, I mean, we both worked in this, but you really designed museums in many respects.
Yeah, I think the big piece of advice that I would have is they're intentionally not linear. Mm-hmm. So we're not intending you to go through these in there's not a specific order to necessarily go through it. And some of them are going to actually branch out, and they're going to really fight against any kind of linear read of it. Yeah. I will say, as we built these, we looked a lot at actual museums. So we had spent a January in Europe going to a number of museums, and since then, whenever I go to a museum, I think about, well, what can this teach me about if we were building CWC museums? So one of the things is, when you go into a museum exhibit, whether it's one of these virtual museums or a real live walking through a museum, you're not necessarily intended to take in everything. So we give you the assignment sheet to say, okay, here's one set of things we want you to for sure look at. We also give you the vocabulary to say, here's another set of things that should guide you. But as we build these, part of it is just, these are other things that we find interesting. And when you're teaching, this is actually one of the things that makes the online course different. And I think this is one of the things that's an enhancement with teaching this course online, is that in a face-to-face course, if I'm giving a lecture, I have to kind of curate and choose, here's the things we're going to talk about. And I'm aware of, well, we're not going to go down these paths. In the museums, oftentimes we just said, well, this is interesting, let's put that in. There may not be an assignment attached to it, but if you find that really interesting, like, you can go down that rabbit hole further. I mean, there's, in the museum you just had on the early church, I mean, we have a 40-minute lecture on Augustine there. It's not, you don't intend necessarily, you don't have to listen to all that, but let's say you're really interested in Augustine's biography. It's there, and you can dive more into that.
Yeah, I think that's really important. There are different kind of levels of engagement. To a certain extent, this replaces lecture, I think, mostly. Like, just a very practical word of advice, like, you ought to have your study guide open in a window on your computer, and then probably the worksheet next to it. Because this is where you're going to encounter those mastery terms, and where you're going to start thinking about how you answer essays on a certain theme, right? So, like, you should always at least have those in the back of your mind, and then the worksheet gives you just a little bit more focus. But you're going to notice that we're always going to end with a kind of open-ended, what else was interesting to your museum, to give just a little bit of an incentive to just exploring, to choosing your own adventure. I mean, it is a real distinct advantage of taking the class this way. It's something we've wrestled with in the face-to-face course. Like, what do we give to enrich, just to satisfy your curiosity? I mean, it's one reason why I'm interested in doing this kind of further reading discussion board. Like, there's no points, there's no credit, it's purely optional, but one of those might click with you, and you might want to go down that rabbit trail instead. So that's a feature of the course that really comes to the front in the museum. But if you don't understand that, it can seem like this is going to take me 6 hours to do because I have to read it all.
Right. Well, and I will say, kind of along those lines, the last question you got asked on the museum assignment was, what were the rooms you found most interesting? One that often pops up is the Christianity Beyond the West room. And this is, I think, an example of a room that sort of, we don't get to do that when we teach a face-to-face course, but we got to push at that idea a little bit. So I was sort of wondering, because you're the one who designed that room, kind of what are some of the thoughts of putting that in that early church room? Yeah,
I mean, it's really struck me that partly from hearing criticism from students, whether that reflects their own background, they did not come from European origins, or simply they're questioning, like, the story starts in Africa and Asia. Does it just stop? Does that just go away because Islam rises or because we go off to Europe? Partly because nowadays most Christians live outside of Europe and North America, right? The church is in some ways, it hasn't really returned to the Middle East quite so much, but it's gone back to Africa, certainly, and to other parts of Asia. And so this is a way of historically nodding at that kind of movement. They're just really interesting stories. The stories of Muslim-Christian encounters we will keep coming back to, because Islam will be an important thread running through Unit 2. We'll kind of nod at it in museums and films. It's a big part of the Bachman text if you want to read that a little bit more closely. I'm always really interested in Christianity, how it survives in Africa. With the Egyptian Coptic Church is maybe the oldest church in the world, and I've had a couple of Coptic students. I've gone to the festival at their church in South St. Paul, and it's part of Eastern Orthodoxy, but it has this really distinct flavor of Egyptian Christianity. And then it's related to the Ethiopian church, which is really fascinating because Ethiopia, for a long chunk of its history, has had Christian monarchs. So you've had a kind of Constantinian Christianity, but totally disconnected, or largely disconnected from the West, a kind of tied Egypt, but really developing on its own, and in really interesting ways. Some of the most fascinating churches in the world are carved down subterranean into the rock of Ethiopia. You can still visit them to this day. There was an Ethiopian monarch who was so devout that he had his subjects, tattoo or inscribe Bible verses on their skin, or parts of the creeds on their skin. And so we tend not to think about that if our story takes us to Italy and Germany and France, and so we at least want to point you in that direction. Sam, why does our story take us to the European West, at least for Unit 2 and then part of Unit 3?
I mean, part of it is the tradition that American Christianity is going to come out of. So if part of CWC is to help students, and largely Bethel students are coming from an American perspective, is that if we want students to find their traditions, the traditions they came to Christ through or they grew up in, it's largely through that tradition. Some of the things that we'll see as we get into Unit 2 is that part of that shifting of the West happens because of the rise of other religions. So you talked about Islam. So I was doing a class for a church group that was going to Italy, and I was talking about the Roman Empire, and they wanted to know, like, well, why is the Pope so important? We'll get to this in Unit 2, but part of it is I put some maps up and I said, here's the early church, and I talked about it was all around the Mediterranean world, and then I fast forwarded to the year 800 or so, and I said, okay, all of these cities in North Africa and in the Middle East, what happened to those cities? And a lot of the truth is Islam spreads, and some of those places that were absolute centers of the church, places like Carthage and Alexandria, where some of the folks that are the most important to the early church, those are no longer, it's not that Christianity isn't there, but they're no longer major centers of shaping Christianity. And then, this course looks at that tie between, and it's going to be an uneasy tie between Christianity and the West. And that, in some ways, that's there from the very beginning. It gets heightened under Constantine. It's going to get heightened as we go into Unit 2.
Yeah, we keep talking about the word significance in this course, and that's an inherently subjective kind of evaluation, right? And it's not to say that those communities are not significant, but in the way the course is set up to help us think about how, as Americans living in the 21st century, we think thoughtfully and prayerfully about culture, the significance is going to be found as we keep following the momentum into the West.
Right, and some of the things that happen when you go back and find your traditions is sometimes it's not all celebratory. Sometimes you're finding baggage, like, oh, this is why we think that, and how do I feel about how that's the origins of this.
Absolutely, yeah. This is not, I would, if you're paying attention, I don't know that you could come to the end of CWC think it was some kind of like celebration of the West. It is that to some extent, and then it's the critique. We'll get more into this. Sam, we've hinted at the exam. It's coming up tomorrow. Can we just pause? Any last minute kind of reminders, advice about taking the exam, preparing for it?
Again, and this is reiterating some things I think Amy and I talked about on the first webisode, but before you click to start that exam, because the clock starts once you start. There's a window of time you can start it within, but once you start it, the timer starts. So get everything you need in front of you and organize your notes, because although it's open note, it's open book, you can use those things. That means when you're grading, we're going to be expecting that, this is somebody who has notes in front of them. These should be pretty complete answers. So when you're writing about something, access your reading packet. And that might mean going back over that reading packet. What studying might look like is organizing those notes, writing out charts, things that'll help you organize your thoughts. So when you get to an essay, when you get to quotation matching, significances, those connection questions we talked about last time, that you have easy access to your thoughts on that. And in truth, if you're relying solely on your notes to take this exam, you're going to be in trouble. It's got to be up here too.
Yeah.
This exam is going to ask you to do a lot of synthetic work, tying terms together, tying themes together, tying readings together. And some of that stuff has to be coming out of you. So I think that's a big piece.
So all I'd add to that is, go back over assignments. Especially in the first unit, we try to take time to write feedback. Some of that is kind of writing formation sorts of things, but other, we're trying to catch things. I've tried to hint, this is going to come back up. I think that will remind you maybe of some significances for vocabulary, or might connect to some themes. As you're using the reading packet, you can download that PDF, you can flag it or bookmark it, you can put notes. Honestly, I'm not great at doing this. My hope is you're a little bit more of a digital native and you're used to using this. But one way or another, I think that's a skill you'll have to master to do well with an online course like this.
So, Chris, we have the 4th of July behind us now. We're recording this a little bit before the 4th of July, but we just celebrated the 4th of July. I think we both were out of town for that.
We were. Yep.
That's why we're recording a little bit early. How How do you, as you think about sort of we talk a lot about church and state, and we read from Augustine thinking about this. What do you think Augustine would have to say to Christians about sort of what you should think about on a day like the 4th of July?
Sure. I mean, I think Augustine would say there's not a simple answer. It's a both and kind of response, because you belong, I think you would hope, in the city of God. That your highest love is that of God, of your Maker, of your Creator, of your Redeemer and your Restorer, right? And that's where eternal peace is to be found, eternal joy, and the beatific vision that Thomas Aquinas will talk about. But that love does not exclude other loves. There is still room for love of family. There is still room for love of beauty, for love of knowledge and study, for love of neighbor, and for love of your country. Maybe even better than the love of state or something. And so kind of as long as you keep those priorities in order, I think Augustine is kind of fine with patriotism of a sort, of a genuine love of your nation, of the people who share your values, who share your land, who share your history with you. And so in that sense, maybe it's okay to engage in kind of festivals that remind us of those things and remind us of the sacrifices that go into it. Where we get in trouble is where that starts to become something like Greek-Roman civil religion, where those are actually religious rituals who are trying to form your loves and shape them so that love of country is above love of God. That's where I think things get dangerous with seemingly innocuous festivals like Independence Day or Memorial Day or Veterans Day, because they make a claim on your soul and a piece of your heart, and they're going to try to tell you that this is what you should sacrifice for and this is your highest priority. And if you start to lose sight of where your highest love is, then you're in another city and you're engaging in idolatry, to put it pretty baldly. And so that's the tension to kind of wrestle with.
And I think, I mean, just to point out what you did there, and I find myself doing this in life all the time, is especially someone like Augustine is really helpful for thinking through these things. I mean, I find myself, my wife and I will often talk about things like, an American flag in a church sanctuary, and like, how do you feel about that? How do you feel about even the national anthem at sporting events, and like, what should your reaction to that be, and things like that. And I often find myself, even in talking to my wife, saying, Augustine said this. And it's not that we have to accept what Augustine said, but he at least gives some framework for saying, here's a way to think about it. How do you feel about his thoughts on that? I think that's really interesting, because a number of the folks we talked about would have pretty different responses to sort of what you should be feeling and thinking at those moments. So I think that's a perfect example of both thinking about relevance, but also thinking about significance. Why is Augustine significant? Because 1,500 years later, he's still useful for thinking through real life questions.
All right, we've established that segment 2 in the webisodes are about games, and we thought since we've got an exam coming up tomorrow, we should do a little bit of vocabulary review, and specifically mastery vocab review. We've established these are especially important terms that we want you not only to be able to identify in a map or a timeline or recognize a description of, but to write about in your own terms, and not simply to describe them, but to explain why they are so significant that they have made the cut in a class like CWC. So our way of doing this, we're not going to go through everything on the study guide, but we did think we'll go through all the mastery terms from Unit 1 and play a little game that we like to call CWC Food Chain. So what we're going to do is Sam and I are each going to list our top 5 most important people from the first unit of CWC. We'll take turns making our case. I think each person gets a chance to respond, and then we'll throw the voting open to you to decide who has successfully made the best food chain. Now you'll see some overlap, probably though some difference. That's partly because we want to give you a wide array of terms, but hopefully this helps you get a better sense of maybe some significances of a pretty good number of these terms. So I will say off the bat, I always incline towards social and political and economic and military history. I'm a little less concerned with the history of ideas, theology and philosophy, literature and art, and so you'll probably see that show up in the differences between our two lists. I'm going to start with number 5, with Perpetua. So you read Perpetua last week. Of course, she is one of the most famous cases of Christian martyrdom in the early church. Dies around the year 203 in Carthage, an important city for Christians in North Africa. I include Perpetua for a few reasons. First of all, I just want to recognize that women are playing an important role in this story. And it's really a struggle for us sometimes because throughout most of the time period we're talking about, most women are not literate. But here we have a case of a woman who is from an aristocratic family, well-educated, and actually wrote, we think in her own words, the story of her trial and at least up to the point near her death. And so I wanted to honor that and just to nod to the fact that women are playing a really important role in the church. She's also a really important figure because she gives us a certain way of thinking about how Christians relate to culture. We certainly do not wish martyrdom for people, but it does get us to think about what are we willing to sacrifice for Christ. And finally, I just think her story is such a great nutshell of this response of Christianity to some of the really important hierarchies of the ancient world. She is responding to the political hierarchy by defying the emperor and expectations of Roman citizenship. She is responding to the paterfamilias, the patriarchy, and standing down her father not once but twice. And so I think she's a key figure for that. Number 4 is going to be Augustine. So also spent some time in Carthage, another North African Christian from about 200 years after Perpetua, from a very different time, in which Christians are not being martyred, but they are in power. And so I think one reason we spend so much time in Augustine is that, especially in the City of God, he's kind of helping think through what does it mean for Christians to have access to power. And he's trying to offer a complicated answer to that. It's not very simple, because there's good that can come of this. And this world is important, but it's not the most important thing. We've already talked about that today. So I don't want to place him too high, but it did strike me. I was doing a post for the Further Reading Board, and I mentioned there's this thing called Open Syllabus Project. And a lot of the things you've read from some of the Greek philosophers and some other figures in the classical world are very popular at lots of different universities. The only person who's a Christian from this part of CWC who is at all popular is Augustine. His confessions are in the top 30 of this Open Syllabus Project. Nothing else from anyone we're going to name who's a Christian shows up on that list, and so I think that tells you some significance. Number 3 is Alexander the Great. So, I mentioned my interest is in things like diplomatic and military history, and obviously he's one of these great conquerors, and so he's important for that reason. He's this really kind of liminal catalytic figure because he helps spread so much of the culture we talk about in the first few parts of the class that Christians then encounter. I mean, the reason that people like Perpetua and Augustine are encountering ideas of Greek philosophy and Greek language and Greek culture and Greek religion is because of Alexander. And so as we think about Christianity and Western culture, Alexander is an and sort of figure. Number 2. So, having downplayed the importance of the history of ideas, I don't think we can downplay the importance of Plato, right? Ian Whitehead says that all of Western philosophy is just a footnote to Plato. Now, I really want to cheat and put like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle as one, because they are this important sequence. I think Sam will talk more about at least one of the others. But if I've got to pick one, he's got to be up pretty high. He's introducing the big questions that we continue to ask. And as you saw last time, I tend to incline a little bit more towards Plato's thoughts about the world. And I kind of feel like we wouldn't know a lot about Socrates without Plato, and I'm not sure Aristotle would have had as much to respond to without his teacher, so I'm going to give him the number 2 spot. But number 1 I'm going to give to Constantine. Not necessarily because I think he gives us the best way for Christians to think about how to live in culture, but if you step back from the big story we're telling, I think this is the hinge figure. There's the story of Christianity and culture before Constantine. It's the story of people like Perpetua. And then there's the story of Christian culture after Constantine. And it's the story of people like Augustine wrestling, but it sets up everything we're going to do in Unit 2. In many ways, it sets up America today as we wrestle with the idea of, we'll call it Christendom. And right now, Americans are wrestling, American Christians, with, is it good to have access to political power? What does it mean to maybe experience marginalization and persecution? Is that okay? And in some ways, we're still living in Constantine's world. So as we step back from this unit, if you're going to understand only one person, he's a pretty good one to understand. Okay.
All right, well, I'll start by responding a little bit to your list. One of the things that I think is a strength of your list is three out of the five figures that you named are Christian figures, which I think is pretty interesting in terms of thinking about CWC. You'll see that my list is, I only have 2 out of my 5 instead of 3 out of my 5. You definitely sort of are showing your biases towards kind of historical movers over people who are kind of more in the history of ideas or in the arts. So my list is going to be a little bit different in terms of that. My first, number 5 for me, is actually a response to Constantine, and that comes in the figure of St. Anthony. To me, Anthony is really important because while Constantine is sort of shifting the landscape as we think about the relationship between Christians and culture, especially church and state, Anthony is there on the scene right at the moment to kind of give an antidote to that, or another way to think about that, a response to that. And so Anthony's important in his moment, but he's also important because he is one of the first movers in a movement that is going to trace through the entire history of Christianity going forward, and that's this monastic sense of Christianity. We're going to see other monastic movements throughout this course, but Anthony we can see as one of the fathers of that movement. So I think he's really significant. I guess this is another part of my list, is there are people whose significance is going to stretch forward a lot more. So some of these folks are going to become significant increasingly as we move into Unit 2. Number 4 on my list is one of my absolute favorites, and that's Homer. As I said, Chris's list is, we have 2 political leaders here. Homer represents the arts, and I think when we think about the ancient Greeks, we think a lot about Plato and Aristotle and Socrates, think a lot about philosophy, but we sometimes forget that the works of Homer are these foundational educational texts for the Greeks, and therefore for the empire of the mind that's created by the Greeks. Homer is read by the ancient Greeks, he's read by the ancient Romans, and going forward, his writings are part of the Western canon in terms of how we think about, traditionally, how we think about heroism, but also, if you read those writings closely, and especially the Iliad is one of my favorite works of literature. The end of the Iliad is just this gut-wrenching scene, towards the end, this gut-wrenching scene about dealing with death and finding grace in these human moments. I think it's really a powerful piece, and it's so significant to Western education, Western ideas, and I want to have the arts represented. I thought about Sophocles, but he's not even my favorite Greek playwright, so we don't read Aeschylus, so he would have been higher than Sophocles for me. Number 3, I have Aristotle. So here we come with our history of ideas, our big philosophers. Aristotle's too important not to have on this list. Plato and Aristotle are just these twin towers of Greek philosophy, and Aristotle really represents the sciences. When we think about the Western tradition, we think about Western thought, the sciences are central, especially as we get into sort of later parts of this story. We're going to see really the rise of the sciences, but we see that sort of empirical, observational mindset already in the philosophy of Aristotle, so to not have him on here is an incomplete list. Number 2 for me is Augustine. And this is another one looking forward. Augustine is going to shape what the church looks like after him. He's going to, you could look at, in the same way Chris had that A.N. Whitehead quote about all of Western philosophy as a series of footnotes to Plato, we could think of Christian theology after Augustine as people wrestling with Augustine. The Reformation is going to be about people wrestling with Augustine. Augustine's going to shape the medieval church, but he's also going to be central to Martin Luther, who's the father of the Protestant Reformation. So he's just unbelievably important, both in his time, but especially going forward. And then for me, the number 1 on the list is Plato. For me, the top 2, and Chris sort of alluded to this, the top 2 are undeniable. You can't talk about the ancient world and Christianity without thinking about these 2 figures. They're actually closely related to each other. Augustine reads Plato, so Plato's influential, and Augustine's influential on Western philosophy. Chris said a lot about Plato, so I won't get too much into that. In spite of which card I was dealt last time, Plato, I'm more on the Plato side than the Aristotle side, but I think this is a pretty solid list in terms of thinking about who are the most significant figures in Unit 1 of CWC. I'm going to hand it over to Chris for your response.
Sure. So I just want to say, we kind of set it up this way because we wanted to talk about different sides of the story. I'm really glad that Homer is on this list. So I mentioned this open syllabus project thing. The Iliad and the Odyssey are both in the top 15. These 2,700 some years later, these are still like the defining texts, along with Republic is number 2. To the extent there's a Western canon, you're seeing the authors of it right here. They're still shaping the conversation in the West. But one thing to point out here is the West has moved geographically. I think it is important to note, and we talked about this in the first segment, that in the first unit, the Christian story is not a European story primarily. Like, we've got some Europeans up here, but we each have 2 Africans on the list. We both have Augustine, I've got Perpetua, and Sam has got Anthony. And the story of Christianity, in many ways, the momentum will take it north and then west. Christianity will still be in Africa, but we're also going to have to tell the story about Islam and the rise of another religious movement.
I'm going to pop in just to talk about one other bias here. Other than Constantine, he's really the only like Roman that we have here, which is kind of interesting with how dominant the Roman Empire is. I mean, Augustus Caesar's one, that was what I thought about, because I feel like, well, how do you do this and not have the empire as the empire represented? Constantine functionally does that, but in a different kind of way.
Yeah, I don't know what this betrays about the course, but the Greeks really do get the lion's share of the glory. And the
Empire of the mind.
Yeah,
Empire
right,
of the mind.
and the Romans just kind of inherit it all. The Romans are just kind of our villains to set up for the Christians first to be persecuted by and then to embrace and be co-opted by, right? So this is our list. These obviously can be contested. Hopefully this helps you maybe step back, think through the significance. If there's no discussion board assignment today, but I will put something on that kind of optional further reading and talking board just to cue you any responses to this, whether you want to agree or disagree with this, or maybe like who's missing, who really belongs on there. If we had like 10 more minutes, I'm sure you want to hear us talk more about this. I'm sure it'd be fun to have like an honorable mention. But maybe you've got someone who you're kind of stunned, like why are they not in the top 5? Let us know.
And vote to see who has the best list.
And vote to see who has the best list. All right, it's happy time, Sam. You ready?
I'm ready.
Let's do this. Happy birthday to Jason Wade. Who, you ask? Well, he's the missionary kid turned frontman of the rock band Lifehouse. What? Lifehouse? Oh, that's right. Jason Wade is 36. Lifehouse was a band that had one of the first hits of the 21st century with Hanging by a Moment. Sam, can we put footage of that video in?
No.
We'll find out. Okay.
I don't think we can clear the rights on that, Chris.
They have actually put out albums, but I think it's fair to say Lifehouse has probably not been heard from a lot since the year 2000, 2001. Sam, would you rather be part of a one-hit wonder or part of a band that had a small but dedicated fan base and never really made it?
I'm kind of into the long game, Chris. So I think I would enjoy if I could get over the frustration of never having made it. I think that's the key. I'm actually really interested in the people who continue to make music once it's sort of that dream is kind of gone. That's actually where I think sometimes it gets interesting. So I'm going to put my foot down for that.
Yeah, I must be drawn to this kind of band because like the bands I like their members are turning 40 or 50 or 60 and they're putting out albums. It's not just for the sake of having an album to tour on, and yet they've never been popular. And there's something about that that's kind of cool.
So Chris, what was the average age of our student in 2001 when this band was last relevant?
I can't do that math.
Probably don't want to.
Okay, look it up, kids. It's on Wikipedia.
Happy anniversary. So Chris, Spam, introduced by the Hormel Food Company, Corporation of Austin, Minnesota, on this day in 1937. Chris, where does Spam rank in the pantheon of Minnesota contributions to the world?
Now, Sam, as you know, I'm an assiduous researcher for this. So last night on Google, I typed in most famous Minnesotans, and I found a list, and it had like Prince, your buddy F. Scott Fitzgerald showed up, our friend Bob Dylan was like number 5 or 6. And then Josh Hartnett showed up at number 3, and I screamed for a good 2 minutes. Josh
Sinclair
Hartnett
Lewis won a Nobel Prize.
Doesn't matter. All of us just say Minnesota's actually churned out some pretty significant figures in the arts and letters.
And when was that list made? Like 2002?
I don't know. And Josh Hartnett. So like it would be easy to, I think, kind of snicker at Spam. Spam is hugely important. I teach a course on World War II, and a big theme of that course is food. There's a good book that came out a few years ago arguing that World War II is fundamentally about food. Like the Germans intentionally tried to starve the Soviets to death. One reason the Red Army prevails is that Austin, Minnesota supplies millions of tons of Spam to the Red Army, and they're able to live. And that's true of other countries. It helps with the refugee crisis. It actually helps turn a tide in history that I think is fairly significant. So I'm going to say it ranks maybe not at Bob Dylan level, but it's pretty high up there. Sam, happy trails to Britain's membership in the European Union, probably. We're still working this through. So Sam, there's a lot of complicated issues related to Brexit, but one thing
Thank you for not asking me about those.
We'll diagnose those later. One thing is clear, the pound is tanking, the euro is not far behind. In our January 2017 travel course, History 230L World War I is getting less and less expensive. Brian, make a sales pitch?
It's getting less and less expensive. Isn't that the sales pitch? No, it's great. I mean, I will say I've had a chance to travel with students on this course. I've also had a chance to travel in Europe on my own after graduating from college, and one of those was far more expensive than the other, and that was when I was traveling alone. There's never an easier, cheaper time to go than when you're a student. Plus, you get to go to these places not just as a tourist, but you get to go as a scholar. And I think that really I mean, this will be my third time going on this trip, and I'm amazed how much I get to learn. And the biggest thing, I mean, if you enjoy history, and I know some of you say you don't, but I know you really do. If you enjoy history, there's nothing like walking in the footsteps of history, going to the location. So, I mean, when we're in, the trip starts with a really amazing moment where we're all standing in Trafalgar Square, kind of in the heart of London, and we're reading about people talking about when war first broke out, everybody flooding to Trafalgar Square, and it's just this really powerful moment. Like, we're where they were, we're looking at some of the things they were looking at. Imagine this place filled with people who were eager to go to war, and then think about where were they going to be even a year later? What were they going to be thinking about even a year later?
I'm literally getting goosebumps hearing this. Like, I'm a history professor, but I think it's true. So I'll say, like, I mean, because of the pound devaluing, it's actually down to like 3,700. Now, some of that's a contingency. We actually wrote checks back to people later. If you're interested, you can email either of us. The deadline is not until September, but I will say we've had 16 applicants. We're not going to take any more than 20. So if you're interested, it's probably worth inquiring sooner rather than later. So that's a sales pitch. I think it was pretty good.
Nice.
All right. So we did not get any We've Got Your Back When recipients, but there's a lot more summer left to go. So as you are traveling up to the cabin or the lake or going...
Where did you go for the
weddings,
4th?
Wherever you went.
Maybe Backman with some fireworks behind it. I'm sure you took that photo.
Take a picture. You can send it. You can send it to Sam. You can send it to me. If you're in an Amy section, you can send it to her. We'll get it on the air for our next
Backman
episode.
pics are the new selfie, right?
I think that's true. Okay, so there's no discussion post tomorrow. This is review night. Hopefully you've been reviewing a little bit already, but put in some time tonight. Get your notes together. Think through, possible essays, themes you might want to reflect on. Go back over previous assignments, and then get a good night's sleep. And the window of time doesn't open until the middle of the afternoon, so you have some time before. But once you start, that clock ticks to 75 minutes. So be ready for it. Have a good internet connection too, so that you're ready to go. Any last words of advice, Sam?
I don't think so.
Enjoy your apple. Kids, we're done. Turn off the iPads.